FuneReality, First Act. Walking into the funeral home to Roland felt like entering a stage, one where everyone knew their lines and cues, except for him. It was like he had been called up in the middle of the night to cram an entire leading role into his brain before opening night. If this were a stage play, though, there would be a chance that everyone would just stop the charade at some point, take a bow and exit stage right before his mother would climb out of the casket and they would all go home. Roland could not remember ever having smoked, but right now he felt like he needed a cigarette. Ashes to ashes and all that. His head was pounding. Everything was moving. He had always assumed a funeral to be a quiet, serene affair, but there was a lot going on. People were talking, moving chairs around, dragging tables noisily to the room to set up what looked like the lunch for later. There was laughter and a general cheerful air to the scene. No one seemed to care that his mother had died. None of the other attendants seemed to notice the mother-shaped hole gaping in the middle of the room, the middle of the fucking world. He felt like reality had taken a step to the left, taking everything else with it and leaving him behind alone in the darkness, with nothing for company but the void where his mother used to be. The longer he watched the scene, the sicker he felt. Everything in the room seemed choreographed, artificial, unreal. But if it was all just a show, where was the audience? Where was the director deciding who enters and exits, who stands around in a group and trades jokes, and who lifts tables and chairs? Or has the play not properly started yet? Maybe that is the reason. The stagehands were still in the process of setting up the stage, so of course no one was in the mood yet. As soon as everything was in its place, the lights would come down, everyone would take their positions, and the play would begin properly. Whoever was dressed in the costume of the priest would lead through the ceremony. Those who had prepared their lines would get to say a few words, and everyone would cry and sniffle and maybe even wail on cue. With an almost perverse glee, Roland noticed that he wished for someone to fall down, tear out their hair, and throw ashes on their head, just to make this FuneReality even more convincing. There was nothing inside him. This was what worried him the most. Just like in the world around him, the passing of his mother had left a hole. There also was a hole inside him, right at the place where he used to store all his feelings. He tried to call up a memory, any memory, even the most banal one, but there was nothing. He could barely remember her face, let alone her voice or any of her mannerisms. There was just nothing. His mother had left the Vale of Tears, and it was as if she had never existed. The dearly beloved would put on a show, as is good and proper, and then everyone would just get on with it. He idly wondered whether the others also had no memories of the way his mother had smelled or what her favorite clothes had been. He might have just wandered over to the open coffin to recall her face and whatever the funeral director had decided his mother should wear for her final curtain call, but he felt no inclination to face the features of his mother, presented here for the last time before disappearing forever in the flames of the crematorium. The thought of his mother catching fire and slowly melting brought back disturbing memories of watching horror movies as a child, as well as the wish that he smoked. If only so he would have an excuse to step outside for a few minutes. Rain fell from an ashen sky, as was befitting for a funeral. Burying his mother in the summer on a bright sunny day with all the flowers in full bloom would have felt even weirder. Then again, the weather was just so perfectly fitting for a funeral, almost as if someone had ordered it just for this occasion. He had never consciously imagined what his mother's funeral would be like, of course not, but it had always been a gray, sad day. Like today. Looking at the window, seeing the raindrops streaked on the window pane, he wanted to burst out laughing and then preferably burst into flames, just so he could leave this absurd theater. Something at the other end of the room caught his eye, some disturbance in the invisible force that seemed to guide everybody's movements. Someone who did not fit in, who also had not received his script on time, who also was winging it. There was a short moment of hope of finding someone who was real, who would be able to help him step through this strange void his mother had left and into whatever reality everyone else was inhabiting, but then all his hopes were crushed when he realized it was only his brother. Thorwald hated funerals. He could not remember ever having been to one, which was of course due to him hating them, and he saw no reason to expose himself to something he clearly knew he hated, just for the sake of trying to figure out whether or not he might actually like it. Especially since he found the idea of enjoying funerals more than just a bit questionable. But this funeral was one that he absolutely had to attend. Today, they would see his mother off before her body would go to the way her soul had already gone, into the eternal flames. He had not hated his mother, as some people to whom he had told this joke assumed. On the contrary, his mother and he had always had a great relationship. He was certain that she found the joke hilarious, or would have found it hilarious had she been alive to hear it. She might have affected to not like it, maybe have shushed him or punched his shoulder, maybe even played the mom card waggling her finger in a scolding manner. But she would have absolutely loved it. If he had accompanied her to anyone else's funeral and made this joke, she would have just died laughing. Well, no, she actually had died, and so no one was laughing. At least, that was what people had told him. A funeral was supposed to be a somber affair. No jokes, no smiles, only tears and wails. But as he entered the funeral home, he realized that whoever had told him that had been full of shit. He had not arrived too late, but he was definitely at the tail end of the gathering crowd, most of which stood around in smaller groups, holding glasses of orange juice or sparkling wine, animatedly talking to each other, laughing, generally having a blast. He wondered whether all these people had actually hated his mother, given the way they carried on. Had they not all been dressed in black and inside a funeral home, he would have assumed to be at a fundraiser for some charity cause or another. It made his blood boil that he had to play the grieving son, was not allowed to crack jokes in his mother's honor, but all these vultures were allowed to carry on like there was nothing wrong. They would, he assumed, eventually enter the FuneReality, sit down and weep for a few moments, but then they would be right back to partying at the so-called wake. A wake was supposed to be a fun event, an event of remembrance. But why was he supposed to remember his mother with all these people crowding the funeral home, most of which were strangers? How would that even work? They were breathing loudly, cackling madly. Their whole presence suffocated him. He wished he had remembered to bring some cigarettes, so he would be able to step out for a minute and smoke in peace, calm his nerves, which felt strung as taut as garrote wire. If he would smoke a cigarette, it would become an ashen flame, similar to his mother. Come to think of it, the coffin was basically an oversized cigar. Another joke no one present would get, but he could almost hear ghastly laughter from the direction of the next room, where the casket had been propped up so people could say their goodbyes. Because none of these leeches had been present at her deathbed to do it there. He had not been present at his mother's deathbed either, and the thought filled the hole deep inside his stomach with guilt and shame. But he put the lid on that to let it fester and boil. It were good feelings. At least he had feelings, not like all those automatons around him, just going through the motions. None of them were real in the sense that his mother had been, that he was. Now that she had died, he was the only one left. And it was an absolute fucking disgrace that these people dared to show up here to soil her memory and spoil his grieving process. His anger rose inside him, like a pool of magma bubbling over, threatening to erupt. He took a few deep breaths. Now was not the time. This was not the place. He needed to make it through the eulogies. First, wait till they all were at the wake, gorging themselves on food and wine, fornicating and defecating, the whole disgusting business on full display, reveling in their inherent filthiness, The funeral automaton switched off for good, all the fake tears spent. That was when he would strike, when he would show them what it meant to be alive, when he would finally make his point. He knew that was what his mother would have wanted. He had not hated her, he had loved her. He would prove it to her and to them all. But by God, his entire body was itching to just go to his car, get the shotgun out of the duffel bag, and massacre all these sacks of flesh right here, right now. He knew he had to contain himself. He knew he had to pace himself. He knew all of this, but it was hard. He could feel his fists clench, his nails digging into his palms, so he rammed them into the pockets of his pants, hitting on one last smoke. Perfect. Now he could step out for a moment, maybe go to the car, look at the bag. That way he would be able to survive the funeral service, to make sure no one would survive the wake. In the end, Roland had decided to step out just for a moment, to take a smoke break. If anyone asked, he'd say he was taking a break from smoking and hope that the other person would laugh. They probably would not, would tell him that it's terrible to crack jokes at a funeral, but it was the best he could come up with at short notice. He drew his coat tighter around his body, his increasingly wet hair losing all sense of purpose or direction, the raindrops streaking down his glasses, turning the scene into an impressionist painting. Like the ones his mother had used to like. He could remember with almost perfect clarity visiting an art gallery with her about 10 years ago, animatedly discussing the paintings as well as just standing before them, motionless, silent, taking them in. But he could not remember a word she had said, the sound of her voice, her posture, or her scent. He knew for a fact he had not been alone, but there was nothing in his memories at the place where his mother was supposed to be. And the longer he thought about it, the more certain he became that seeing her lifeless, waxen face propped up on a white pillow, surrounded by wreaths, would not help bring her back. If anything, it might have the opposite effect, overriding the mom-shaped hole with this mom-adjacent mannequin, this thing that had once been his mother, full of spirit and joie de vivre, now was nothing more than a hunk of rotting meat, like the choice cut at the butcher's shop. He shuddered. What a gruesome thought, but maybe he needed to get used to these sorts of thoughts now that he had entered the FuneReality, where his mother was absent and he was more alone than he had ever been, lost in a world that ran on a script he couldn't understand or remember. He heard the trunk of a car slam shut and saw the shape of his brother moving towards him. Oh, great. Just what I needed. Thorwald sat in his car, the seat in a reclining position, eyes closed, slowly and deliberately dragging on his cigarette. Judging from what he had seen inside, they would take quite some time to finish setting up their little charade, so he would take his time, try to calm his raging mind, try to focus on the task ahead. He had turned on some music to tune out the sound of the raindrops hitting the roof of the car. The little pitter-patter, pitter-patter, pitter-patter they made reminded him too much of the earth being shoveled onto a coffin, and he had come here to escape the FuneReality of the day, not increase it. He wondered whether anyone would miss him, then smirked at the thought. They probably had not even noticed him entering. How could they miss him when he left? He wanted nothing more than to start the car, drive somewhere else, but the guns he had in his trunk spoke to him, told him that it needed to be done, and it needed to be done here. If it were to mean anything at all, he would have to shoot up his mother's funeral. A ritual spilling of blood for the departed. Everyone handled grief differently, after all. It was absolutely asinine, the way they tried to come to terms with it, meeting up in some funeral home, holding a small service, everyone sitting quiet and solemn, pretending to grieve, before moving on to the revels that came after. It was not so much holding a ritual, it was just going through the motions. Programmed automatons following a script, the idea of deviating from it, of doing anything that was real, never even crossing their circuits. His mother had been different, had been able to overcome the limitations of the machine that was her body. She had been a beautiful mind ripped from this reality too soon by a malfunction of the meat suit. It was not fair, and the least he could do was to settle the score. He hoped that those who pretended to pray really got their heart and soul into it, because if there was such a thing as God, they would be meeting him pretty soon. His cigarette finished, he got out of the car and walked back to the gravestones towards the hall, seeing a figure standing in front of the doors, a silhouette in the gloom and fog. The crouched posture was familiar somehow, even if he could not place it. Drawing nearer, he realized that it was none other than his brother. Oh, great, just what I needed. The two brothers stood there in the rain for a few seconds, seizing each other up. Both knew they would need to talk, while also being acutely aware that there was nothing they had to say to each other. The silence stretched, amplified by the sounds of the rain and faint music coming from the funeral home as someone tested the speakers. And still neither of them said anything. Roland's hair had now completely given up and turned into a sort of mop, trails of rain running down the back of his neck into his shirt. His shoes were soaking through, and coming out here had been one of the worst ideas in a lifetime spent having bad ideas. Roland wanted to turn around and go back inside, anything to get away from his brother. Even more, he wanted to brush past his brother and walk to the parking lot, just drive away to his usual spot on the bridge and contemplate jumping, even if the rainy weather put him off suicide because it seemed too melancholy. Thorwald looked immaculate when compared to his brother, despite the fact he was wearing neither black nor a suit. It had always baffled Thorwald how he and his brother could both be children of the same amazing woman. Then again, Roland was the older of the two, so maybe he had been the test run, the beta version. Knowing his brother was there to fail their mother one last time made Thorwald almost want to leave. She would have understood, of course she would. But the whispered promises of bloodshed coming from his trunk made him stay, made him even break the silence, finally starting a conversation, continuing a failure to communicate that had been going on for the past 20 years at least. Hi. Hi. What are you doing here? I'm just, taking a smoke break. I don't see any cigarette. That's because I'm taking a smoke break, like a break from smoking, Why do I even bother talking to you? With a sigh somewhere between anger and resignation, Thorwald pushed past Roland to the door and went inside, back to the automatons getting ready for the next step in their programmed scripts. Roland was right behind him, his shoes making squishy noises on the polished floor of the funeral home. He was an embarrassment and he knew it. Everyone was looking at him. Not at Thorwald, showing up in a white shirt with a blood splatter pattern and the caption, "Don't worry, that's not mine," and cargo shorts. No, everyone was looking at Roland, who had bought a suit, who had tried and failed to learn how to knot a tie and gotten his ex-wife to do it. "And I'm not doing this for you, I'm doing this for your mom," as she had reminded him. He looked a mess, and he knew it. Both brothers, as they took their place at the front of the audience, had dreams of violence swimming through their heads. Both were aware of all the eyes in the room drilling into their backs. Both brothers reached deep inside them, tried to find something, anything that even resembled the feeling, be it sadness or guilt, grief or shame. But there was nothing, just a dark, pulsing hole ever expanding, its snake-like shadowy tendrils creeping outward, obscuring their visions, dragging them ever deeper into the FuneReality of a motherless world. But Roland's hole threatened to swallow him, whereas Thorwald's hole was threatening to swallow everyone else. Neither of them, of course, knew of the other's struggle, and even if they had been aware of it, there would have been nothing either could have said to help his brother. They both closed their eyes, counted to 10. When they opened them again, they saw the speaker moving to the podium, ready to deliver the first part of the eulogy. Both of them simultaneously reached for their pockets, realizing that they had forgotten their prepared speeches in the car. This was going to be a long service.